Hi, I'm Benjamin Studebaker.
And I'm David McKerracher. You're listening to Why Left.
So today on Why Left, we're going to talk a bit about a piece I wrote, Don't Name Names, about an idea Dave has, go to churches, and where do academics fit into all of this? All of this and more on this hour of Why Left.
Yeah, and in particular, I think the thing that connects those two is the problem posed by workers with earbuds. Uh, so for all of you workers with earbuds listening to this right now, that's right. We are a problem. Now, why are we a problem? We're a problem in a variety of ways. And I think that there's currently a crisis in academia as well as in the podcast sphere, and that people are trying to figure out what to do about it. That is to say, um, experts are feeling impotent and not taken seriously, and like the podcast sphere is also not going to loop in experts in a serious way. Um, and then workers with earbuds as autodidacts, we are able to set ourselves up to be something between or beyond the traditional divide, the divide set up between experts and those lowly workers who are supposed to, take their marching orders from those experts. And, I know Benjamin's got a lot of thoughts about this, and I'll show how that ties into the name names go to churches themes in a minute. But I first want to tie it to something relevant, timely, sensational. A lot of the listeners are probably pretty familiar with it. Douglas Murray, who's been a pretty big anti-woke spokesperson, conservative, but also in the last year and a half or so, whatever, has been super pro-Israel, anti-Palestine protesters.
Muslims do not love other Muslims. They have no love for them. They have no love for the Palestinian peoples. None. If they had any, the Jordanians would have taken in the West Bank Palestinians. The Egyptians would have taken in the territory they used to run, the Gaza, and own the Gaza, and they would have taken in the Palestinians from the Gaza. Why have the Egyptians made sure that not one Palestinian is allowed to leave Gaza? Why do they make sure that their border wall is tough as anything? What do they mind? One thing: Jews living. Jews living and Jews winning. It hits them deep in their soul, in their psyche. It's an ancient, ancient hatred. The deepest and the ugliest, the nastiest, and the one that has been least addressed. And we've imported it.
Douglas Murray, he goes on the Joe Rogan Experience to have a conversation with Dave, who's like a historian hobbyist. I mean, he's not a historian. He's a hobbyist who likes to read about history, and he's done a lot of his history related podcasting. And they were supposed to have a conversation about Israel and Palestine, but instead, Douglas Murray comes out the door basically just being like, who is this guy? Why is he here? Why should I have to talk to him about this? He's not an expert. Have you been to Gaza, Dave?
Somebody who says, I don't know what I'm talking about, but now I'm going to talk. Or I don't know about this. Or I'm not capable of debating this historian, but I'm going to just tell you what I think. A lot of shit out there. I think there's a whole bunch of guys doing that. I think Dave is doing that, very obviously. Dave's a comedian, but he's now mainly talking about Israel.
Why is it that you podcasters always think that you have the right to talk about things like this? It should be experts, right? And so he comes out kind of guns blazing, and the first 45 minutes of that episode are incredibly painful to watch
It's
The
hard to
World
do.
Bank said in 1996 for the
Now
one
the
year of the
libertarians
blockade.
are quoting the World Bank. I love it.
It doesn't mean anything. This is a non-argument. Yes, I'm saying the World Bank did their own analysis of this, and they said that it was a 40%
you do
of
your
the,
own analysis?
Hold on. You
Jesus
got to
Christ.
stop interrupting
Okay.
and let him finish
I
the
will.
sentence.
The
Fire
World
away.
Bank said that 40% drop in the GDP of 1 year due to the blockade. And there's been a blockade from 2007 on. So are you saying that this hasn't had an economic effect? Is that the argument?
No, of course it'll have an economic effect.
So you're saying
But-
you have to be on the ground and do an audit of the blockade
No,
in order to be able to
I
comment
think
on
you
it?
should at least know what it is, what the territory is, what the situation is in the region. Yes, absolutely.
And the only way
Absolutely.
to do that is to be there in person.
I think that's the best way. It's not the only way, but it's the best way, for sure. For sure. If you have never seen the countries in question, you've never spoken to the people in question, you've never interviewed anyone, you've never gone around, you've never seen the terrain, and so on, and you've used Wikipedia, I'm sorry, no, that's not the same thing.
Okay, well, I've not just used Wikipedia. I don't know. Either take on the arguments or don't, but I don't
But
think
I'm
like...
saying, but your argument's incorrect.
Oh, okay, fine. Well, then present a counter argument to it. But to just tell me I'm not allowed to talk about something
I'm
because
not
I'm not an
saying
expert.
you're not allowed to
okay,
talk
fine. Well,
about
you're
it.
not
I've
an
said
expert, so
repeatedly,
you shouldn't
you're
talk
talking
about
about
it.
it
You
now.
haven't been there. Yeah, I know. But you keep playing this game where it's like the whole opening to this podcast was like the non-experts talking about this is such a problem. Now you're saying because I haven't been there, I can't talk.
because Douglas Murray's kind of talking himself in circles, and also anybody who knows anything about his background should know he is not an expert in this issue. He's not himself a historian. He's got a bachelor's in English, and so the whole thing is kind of just like, what is going on here? We've got a guy who's not an expert claiming he's an expert, saying that the other guy's not an expert because he hasn't been somewhere, and ultimately both Dave and Joe are kind of taking the sensible position, which is like, well, if you've read a bunch of books about something, you should be able to talk about it. I mean, honestly, everybody thinks that they should be able to talk about something, even if they haven't read books about it. And obviously that's the American condition in a sort of sense. But at least in the case of this Dave guy, he had read a whole bunch of books about it. So that doesn't make him an expert, but it does mean that obviously he's going to want to process what he's thinking about by talking about it. So this was sensational. Then Piers Morgan, of course, had that podcaster Dave onto his show and brought someone else who was basically arguing the same thing. Well, you don't understand just law theory, and you don't understand the difference between a genocide and a this and a that and the other. And Dave's like, yeah, but at the end of the day, I should be able to talk about it. Like that's what this is really about, is I should be able to talk about it. And I should be able to say, I don't like what I'm seeing. Like that is what this kind of comes down to. Now we could focus on that. I do want to come maybe eventually on a future episode, come back to the Israel-Palestine thing. I was actually just reading a piece you wrote about it last year, Benjamin. And that'd be great to get into, but I kind of want to zoom out from that to this issue of experts versus the plebes, doing the work, looking into these things for themselves, and the sort of contentious sort of contradictions emerging there. And so, yeah, let's start with what your thoughts are about that, and then we'll bring it back to the piece that you wrote.
Yeah, it's always the people who aren't really proper experts who try to whack people over the head with claims to expertise. I've tended to notice that it's people with undergraduate degrees from prestigious institutions or people with master's degrees who most typically will try to whack you over the head with something on the basis of their education level. Part of what a PhD teaches you is that these questions are methodologically difficult. And just because you have a PhD doesn't mean you're going to have the correct answer or an easy, pat narrative of what's going on. It doesn't make things simpler to get a PhD. It makes them more complicated. Certainly, if you get the kind of PhD that's worth getting, a PhD that doesn't have this effect on you, hasn't done its job, isn't really a real PhD, I would say in some sense. There are, I think, certain characteristic flaws that come out of being an academic, and there are also certain characteristic flaws that come out of being an autodidact. The flaws that come out of academia are largely to do with cowardice. So someone who goes to the trouble of getting a PhD with the express purpose of getting a job in the neoliberal academy, in the increasingly precarious academy that's hyper-competitive with very few jobs, such a person has to do whatever is necessary to be competitive, and so has to accept and internalize the competitive logic of the system, has to be very careful not to rock the boat, upset people, has to network a lot, has to go to conferences, make nice with people. Such a person has to be continuously thinking about what will other people in the academy think about me if I do this or that? What will a jobs committee think about me if I do this or that? Could I get canceled if I do this or that? And so there tends to be a group thinkiness and a cowardice to the academic, which can sometimes limit the ability of academics to think outside the box. You also get rewarded for publishing repeatedly in a very narrow area. So you don't get rewarded for reading widely. You don't get rewarded for being someone who has a breadth of knowledge across multiple different fields or even subfields or even research areas. You get rewarded typically for over-specializing in something quite specific. So there tends to be sometimes a lack of contextual awareness on the part of academics, which can make them seem out of touch. There's also the kind of language that's typically used at academic conferences and among academics, which isn't the best sort of language for speaking to and for the public, which is in part why many academics are not sought after for shows. They're not able to communicate in a style that's accessible. And then they make learning to communicate in an accessible style into a technocratic trait, into something that they teach you in a managerial setting. And so even the people who have learned this technical skill come across as processed, come across as representatives of a bureaucracy here to talk to you, the layperson, not someone who's having an equal conversation with you in which they're treating you like a real interlocutor. Conversely, the autodidacts have a different set of problems. One is, even if they read a lot of books, they don't necessarily know which books are good. So sometimes they will treat books that are not good as if they're just as good or better than books that are much better. They aren't necessarily equipped to evaluate the quality of the stuff that they're reading. They're often locked out of the university libraries that would give them access to a lot of the journals. So they don't tend to have a lot of that. The books that are cheap and widely available tend to be less good. They tend to be trade books published by big trade publishers, not UPs, who tend to peer review the research thoroughly, but then in this day and age, charge an arm and a leg for it. So if you're an academic, you can have your work peer reviewed and you can have it checked. But if you do that, odds are they're going to charge a lot more for your book unless you're at a stage of career where one of the UPs will put out your book as a trade book. Say sometimes Oxford University Press will do a trade book with an academic who's well established. But generally, particularly for people early in their career, your choice is to have your work peer reviewed and cost a fortune, or to have it not peer reviewed and therefore not be regarded the same way within the academy. And if you haven't gotten to a stage of career where you have enough of a public following, nobody's going to care about a book that is a trade book from somebody that nobody's heard of who hasn't published any academic works. You've also got the tendency for autodidacts to be insecure. Because they haven't been recognized for the reading that they've done, nobody has said, yes, actually, you do know what you're talking about. If there is some kind of sharp disagreement, autodidacts tend to take things personally. They tend to be more resistant to being taught by somebody who does specialize in the area that they've read in. So they can be difficult to talk to and argue with, and frustrating for that reason, because they will tend to take it personally if you go after something that is their kind of hyper fixation, objective fixation that they've kind of identified with and used to kind of tell themselves that they're not like everybody else because they've read up on this thing. It becomes very difficult then to correct them and try to improve them, which is in part why it's easier to teach 18-year-olds who have not gone into the workforce and then attached to their interest as an enclave than it is to teach people who are currently in work for whom this is a special interest that helps them to feel like they're still a human being. So this leads to communication problems in both directions, I think, and it makes it difficult for people to sit down together and just talk.
So on the academic side, we have a kind of cowardice and groupthink. And on the autodidact side, a sensitivity that makes it difficult to have a conversation or disagreement.
Hubris, and then sometimes ignorance regarding quality of sources.
Hubris.
You know,
And
for instance, if you
ignorance.
read a
Okay.
lot of books published by, I don't know, Norton or HarperCollins or somebody like that about an issue, and you're talking to somebody who is reading UP books and is reading journal articles and maybe has gone to a library and done archival research, you will think that you've read a lot, but they're not going to think that what you've read is very good, and you're not going to necessarily recognize or realize that, and it's going to be, that's going to produce a sharp conflict. Though in this particular case that you're discussing, Douglas Murray is not someone who has done those things. He has not published in journal articles. He hasn't written UP books about that issue. He hasn't gone into the archives. He may have traveled to the country, but that's a very different thing. Sometimes people will say, well, I've been to this country. So lots of people go lots of places. That doesn't matter. What matters is, have you actually studied it?
Right. He's had the IDF give him a curated tour, right? That's not the same thing as being a journalist there,
Yeah, people
It's
often say this about China, that they've been to Shanghai or they've been to Beijing and it looks so clean, therefore China must be this very rich country. And, this is not how you figure these things out.
right. Well, this problem with autodidacts being difficult to disagree with or challenge, being because of this sort of sensitivity, this hubris, we could also call it hubris, pride. Um, okay, so I think that's a real issue, and I will want to, I think, dig in a little deeper on it. But going back to this academic issue, though, where we're talking about a kind of cowardice and a groupthink, I think my experience of the university scene was that it is very hypersensitive, and I don't mean in like a woke way, which is also obviously a thing. You do have people in certain sections of academia where cultivating their sensitivity or their proclivity to taking offense is seen as like a virtue or something. It's like they're doing it for the sake of the other that they are trying to center or represent. Uh, but no, a kind of sensitivity related to pride does seem to be there. And not only is it present, but you also see it when you read academic work. Um, it's almost like a lot of the writing, I don't know, I don't want to say a third of the writing, but it feels like a lot of the writing is delicately trying to finesse the egos of the other people in the journal or at the conference in the field where they're trying to present their intervention.
They're scared that if they don't put it in a very sensitive way, that the work will not get through peer review, or it won't get published, or it won't be well regarded. They are afraid of what might happen if they adopt a more confrontational pose. They've learned over the course of their career that when they come right out and say things, their stuff doesn't get through peer review. And so they're scared to not get through. And this is, because some peer reviewers will try to use peer reviewing to police what can be said in various ways.
Right. And so this is a different kind of sensitivity. Like in general, it would be a different kind of sensitivity because it's a sensitivity where you're trying to not offend the others who might close doors to you, as opposed to a kind of sensitivity that's going to take everything personal.
Yeah, it's a political sensitivity. It's a concern about getting in a kind of political trouble. And that's not narrowly to do with what we might think of as politics or ideology. It's, there's politicking within the physics discipline. There's politicking in the natural sciences. There's a concern about how the community of scholars will react or respond to something. And something that's new or that challenges established thinking has to be more politically sensitive in the way that it's expressed so as not to anger people who might then attempt for political reasons to box it out. And the reason that people would get angry, it's not just that their pride would be challenged, it's that if you go after an established paradigm or method or way of doing things in a discipline, you are going after the employability of people. You're potentially going after the employability of their students. So, for instance, if you wage a methods war against Marxism in the academy, then Marxists who are in the academy might be able to continue being in the academy until they retire if they've got tenure. But their students will increasingly struggle to get jobs, and the journals that they publish in will lose influence. They'll get cited less often. And so gradually it will become harder and harder to be someone with that method and be in the academy. And this is something that can happen gradually over a period of time. We typically refer to these as methods wars, and methods wars shape ultimately what counts as a valid claim, what will be treated as a claim to knowledge. So they are quite important. And in my own case, I have always tried to cultivate a pluralistic attitude, in part because as an academic, I operate in a context where many people are interested in fighting methods wars. And I try not to do that, in part because I think in a methods war, somebody like me is likely to lose. I'm not someone who likes to write very quantitative, economisty work. I do kind of old-fashioned political theory, which could potentially be endangered in a very intense methods war that's focused on research impact to do with quantitative metrics. So I try to practice a live and let live attitude because that's what I think ultimately best serves my work. But for many people in other positions, they're not going to have that attitude. And I also think that it's better to have a pluralistic attitude in a discipline because that makes the discipline more open. And part of why I picked political theory as a subfield is because of its relative openness. There's a lot of different approaches that fly under the heading of political theory.
Now let's see if I can pull up the quote as I talk about it. But basically, in The Idea of the University, Carl Jaspers talks about this problem that you're talking about because, of course, he's thinking about what is the idea of the university as opposed to the reality of the institution that gets taken over by either politics or economics or obviously both. But of course, he's writing this in the aftermath of the Nazi occupation and censorious regime of the university. And so he's talking about the reconstitution of the university after the Nazis had basically come in and told everyone what they could or couldn't write, and so he's writing in a context where everybody's aware that totalitarian politics is going to want to take over the university. And so in reconstituting the university, everybody's looking in that direction. And he's like, but guys, there are other tendencies inherent to the institution of the university, including business interest. And he basically says, if we're not going to be guarding against the business interest, then the idea of the university will still be lost. It will still be lost, just not to totalitarians necessarily, but to capital, basically. And, he's not exactly a leftist, sort of communist. He's just aware of the business interest, of course, because he's sensible.
Yeah, a lot of academics get their funding from granting organizations, external funders. Those external funders have overt political agendas in many cases, and then there's a fear of running afoul of those funders. So even if you're in a situation where your work might be accepted methodologically by other people in your discipline, there's a question of can it get external funding? And that question has become more and more important over time as the sources for funding have become more overtly politicized in many, many fields.
Yeah, exactly. And now one of the other tendencies of the institution that he hits on, and by the way, for folks, this is a primary text at Theory Underground as far as the corpus goes, the corpus of texts that have been central at Theory Underground. We started with a short course on the idea of the university in January 2023. It was taught by myself. Brian Weeks and my wife, who was, I believe at the time, my fiance. And so, yeah, we taught this because all of us have a background in education, but also in various lines of critique against education, or the ways that it tends to go nowadays. And so, Brian Weeks was coming at this from the standpoint of someone who had just done a master's on critical pedagogy and education theory, and he is also during that time teaching at one of those schools for dropouts, right, where the problem kids go, and underserved communities or what have you. And so for him, this was all very close to his heart because he himself was a dropout when he was a teenager. And of course, all my friends when I was a teenager were dropouts. And Anne, on the other side, was never a dropout. In fact, I don't think she knew any dropouts. She was the international baccalaureate, star student. And her approach was a critique from the standpoint of critiquing neoliberalism through sociology. And that was the kind of research that she had done at the university. And so we're all coming at this from our own approaches. But the reason we use the idea of the university as a text is because Carl Jaspers is, first of all, he's a sort of existentialist. He's part of the field that I'm coming from, but also he's responding to, the Second World War and the Nazism in particular. But instead of just doing a critique, he spends a lot more time doing this sort of Neoplatonist thing, which is, what's the idea of the university? We should think about the negative tendencies of the institution so that those can be safeguarded against. But you can't just critique or safeguard against negative tendencies without losing the plot. The plot is you have to prioritize the idea. The ideal has to be upheld. And so that's what I really loved about this, is that it's different than most of the stuff that is critical of the university, because it spends a great deal of time fleshing out the idea itself. And so Benjamin, have you ever read this one, Benjamin?
I have not read Carl
Okay.
Jaspers, actually, myself.
This would be a lot of fun. It's a short book. One of these days we should do it as like maybe bring the course back, just spend a few weeks on it. But I think as a Neoplatonist, I think you would love it.
Yeah, you could tell what the university system still does, or parts of it in fleeting ways still does, by looking at the people who don't have any exposure to it and seeing what their problems are. For all the problems that there are with academics, there are also big, big problems with self-taught autodidacts. They don't know how to sort the literature. They are not, they don't acquire the humility, the intellectual humility that you typically get by being continuously in the university environment for a period of time. It does, sometimes that's excessive to the point where academics are questioning themselves so much and they're too afraid to take up something and float it and express it and champion it. But it's a kind of excessive humility that turns into cowardice that really afflicts academics. Terror at going into the conference and being picked apart, terror at being made fun of and mocked and treated as one of the bad people by your colleagues. This is the kind of stuff that really affects academics. Fear of humiliation. The autodidacts.
Well, let's come right back to the autodidacts in a second, but because what you just said is the bridge back to why I pulled up this quote, which I'll read because it's basically what you're saying. And then we'll move into the problem with the autodidacts. So he said, paradoxically, the unlimited freedom in research and teaching to which each member of the university is ideally entitled serves not only to promote that unrestricted communication, which exposes everyone to radical doubt, but it also promotes a tendency to enclose the specialist in his field, to make him untouchable, to isolate him instead of encouraging him to communicate. Everybody leaves everyone else greater liberties so as to be entitled to them himself and to be safe from the meddling of others. The conduct of faculty members has been compared to that of the monkeys on the palm trees of the Holy Grove at Benares. I don't know if that's how you pronounce that. On every palm tree sits a monkey. All seem to be very peaceful and minding their own business, But the moment one monkey tries to climb up the palm tree of another, he runs into a heavy barrage of coconuts. Similarly, mutual respect in university circles tends to a state of affairs where everyone may indulge his every inclination or caprice, with the result that the university no longer centers on matters of common concern. Common concern is tactfully reserved for formal occasions. Thus, it can happen that everybody approves everyone else's candidates for academic appointment simply in order to have freedom in this matter oneself. Basic criticism is avoided. Communication, which ought to be an intellectual battle for clarity and substance, becomes a purely outward relationship governed solely by considerations of politeness. It goes on, but I really just wanted to read the part about the monkeys with the coconuts because I love that.
Yeah, there's that side to it. And then, of course, the other side is if you do try to have the communication, it quickly devolves into very intense political fighting where jobs and livelihoods are at stake and people try to ruin each other to get ahead. And it gets very, very nasty, very, very fast. And it's because of the nastiness of this. And like a war, you don't know what's going to happen or what will befall you once you kick this kind of thing off, that people prefer the live and let live. Both of these things have major weaknesses to them. But we would really need a different kind of structure to avoid the constant back and forth between periods where academics stay out of each other's way and periods where academics rip each other to shreds in front of everybody.
Yeah. Yeah. And so then this directly relates to the piece that you wrote about don't name names, because you're essentially saying a lot of this academic writing gets very caught up in this need to name everybody or to put a name to every idea. If you want to critique an idea, you have to name the name. And so I think there's a slippery slope here for autodidacts who already might be prone to not name names. And so what you're writing, so I guess I kind of just want to hear you lay out your thought process for this piece, because I know it's not a rule that you're trying to say we should always follow. You're just trying to say there's multiple ways of writing. This is a way that maybe doesn't get pushed enough as a proper way forward if you want to write about an idea.
Yeah. So sometimes you're trying to write in a way that is more suitable for the academic setting than you've been able to do. And in that case, you have to follow the academic forms. You've got to do your citations. You have to show that you've engaged with the literature. And if I'm teaching somebody to write like an academic in a course setting, that's always what I'm going to push because that's what you got to do. But if we're talking about writing for the public online, I think one of the things that has gone badly wrong in the era of social media is that everybody feels like to make any kind of point, you have to have an example. And the example is someone that gets dunked on as hard as possible in front of as many people as possible. They get quote tweeted and dunked on, and you go, aha, see, here's this social problem. And this person, this is the exhibit A. This, of course, is not how people get name checked in academic papers. When people get name checked in academic papers, you are careful in terms of how you address what you think is wrong. You're polite. You do all of these things to try to avoid provoking. Because you're citing them, you're giving them something statistically that they can show, in terms of my work is being taken up. Even if you're taking it up negatively or critically, you're saying it's bad work. By citing it, you're acknowledging that it's important enough that academics have to debate, discuss, talk about it. So you give somebody something which is beneficial to them in their career when you cite them in an academic setting. But when you just take random people online and you dunk on them, this just really hurts people's feelings. It causes people to get shamed and harassed. And it often causes people to become preoccupied with the example. People become obsessed over whether the example really is a case of that thing. They start moralizing about the person who is the one who committed the mistake. And they get further and further away from why is it that people do this kind of thing in general? Why is it that this is a phenomenon that we have to deal with in general? And so any attempt to try to analyze it at a structural level gets buried very quickly in personal drama. And the person that you're humiliating will try in various ways to fight back often or to resist being used this way. And this will produce drama. And then the focus becomes on the drama and on the back and forth. And whatever the original point was, it's completely lost. And you certainly aren't going to recruit that person or that person's followers or fans into what you're trying to do by trying to use them as an example of everything that's wrong with humanity and with the world. That's not going to bring any of them around. What it does is it increases hostility and it creates a greater level of separation between them and you than previously existed. So for this reason, I think that oftentimes when we're on the internet, if I'm podcasting or if I'm tweeting or if I'm writing a blog post, I will tend not to highlight particular individuals that have made me think of something if what I'm thinking of is primarily a negative thing. And I do this because I don't really think it's the fault of particular people that we have negative social trends. I'm not looking to hold them to account. I don't care about accountability, really. Generally, I don't care about it. I'm not interested in accusing people of crimes or accusing people of misdeeds. That's not really why I write. I'm not here to police the discussion. I just want to talk about why is it that in general, it seems like certain kinds of trends pop up again and again. And these trends don't seem to help us think in various ways. When we participate in these trends, they tend to make us think worse, and they tend to limit what we're able to discuss and the level of sophistication with which we're able to discuss it. Can we notice that and then resist that tendency of the culture and the mediums that we're in? The only way that you can resist the tendency is to not do the naming of the names.
I guess I feel like this is one of my kinds of writer's block, like one of my greatest forms of writer's block. In fact, I just wrote a piece that I was pretty excited about publishing, but I did name names. And then I thought about it, and this was about a month and a half ago. This was before you wrote that article. And so, but I was just aware, I was like, if I publish this opens me up to kind of having to engage with these people in a way where I don't really want to engage with them anymore, or I never wanted to engage with them in the first place. Now, in one of the names, it's a person I want to be able to continue to engage with, and I thought, well, this could potentially backfire because it doesn't really put him in a negative light, but it does put somebody he works with in a negative light, because somebody that he works with did something to me in public, and it was very reactive and sensational. And I wanted to talk about that because the thing that triggered that whole thing in the first place was this idea that we should, it's kind of what the article is actually about, which is I don't care about Zoomers or influencing Zoomers, right? And this is actually something that has repeatedly gotten me weird flack. And the thing is like, so I wanted to write about this. The fact that I'm getting like that saying something like, oh yeah, well, I'm not trying to influence Zoomers, gets me this weird explosive reaction from people when I'm least expecting it. It's very like, maybe I'm just autistic and I'm missing some kind of a social cue. But then I'm like, no, I don't think that this is like a thing anyone is aware of that will get you you know what I mean? It's like you kind of have to breach this barrier by saying you don't care about influencing Zoomers. And because most people don't say that, it's not even on people's radar of things that they would say. Nobody's experiencing this themselves. And so I kind of felt like to write this piece, I have to actually tell the story of a few of the times where this is kind of exploded in my face in a way where it's like, I think you should leave skit. I'm just standing there going, is this real? Like, is this person really this upset with me? Because to me, it's not. If someone said, I'm not trying to influence Zoomers, or if I'm not trying to critique boomers or something like, I wouldn't be like, oh, well, you should, or why do you say that? Or I wouldn't take offense, at least. And I don't think anyone could possibly imagine that it would be so sensational. But it also happened after the platypus convention on the last night when we were outside the bar. I ended up saying that and getting the person didn't like it. We'll just, and in front of several other people was like chewing me out. And, she was a little drunk and everybody was kind of like, that's weird. But I was like, oh, this has happened before. This is like a thing now. Okay. So with all that said, I named names when I first wrote this. And then I was like, well, I don't want to have a conversation with her. And I don't want to have a conversation about this other person's friend or associate. And then I'm like, okay, so then I've gone back to the piece and tried to edit it like 3 times. But it's such a chore trying to sterilize it from from the particularity of these examples. And so this is why I'm saying it's a kind of writer's block. I don't know what to
And
do
it makes
about
it less shareable. It makes it less shareable because it doesn't have the same potential for drama. When you name names and you give concrete examples that make something very visceral to people, then it makes it more shareable and you get a lot more drama. And this is why a lot of shows work on the basis of take a current event, take an example, take something that's happened between real people, put names to them, and discuss it, and then try to get from there into something more complicated, because the assumption is that that's the way that you bring people in. You bring people in with something low, something that taps into base human desires for status or concern with status competition. And you use that to then try to move into something higher. But very rarely does that happen. Very rarely, when you start in Time and the status energy and you feed that, do you then get from there into agape or some other kind of higher energy. Instead, typically what happens is you just get caught in the Time loop. You stay in the honor loop, and it becomes very, very focused on who comes out on top, and it's very win-lose. And then this invites a kind of thinking that is either or, non-dialectical, me or you, mano a mano thinking, that doesn't generate something better. The trouble is, if you don't do this, it does seem to have this effect of sterilizing. It does. And the way that academics name names, they do it while sterilizing. They name names and sterilize.
Yeah.
The question is, can you not name names without sterilizing? Can you write about something conceptually in a way that is still sufficiently inviting that some number of people can be brought into it without the use of the names and the honor discourse as a way of motivating people to come into the piece? It's more difficult to do, and you have to accept that you won't get as big a readership if you do it. And something I've done throughout my time commenting is just accept that I make a lot of decisions that reduce the number of people that are going to pay attention to what I do. And a lot of the time, the stuff that I do that gets the most attention is bad because in some way it deviates from this principle.
Oh, really?
If I get too much attention for something, I wonder, it's an invitation to think, did I concede too much here to the medium? I've even had cases where, somebody that I cited in a book, who I was very careful not to talk badly about online, got mad about criticism that they got from me in a book because they weren't an academic, they were a journalist. And so don't think in terms of I'm getting academic citations because it's in an academic book. So for them, there's no obvious benefit in being criticized in an academic book. And so they got quite upset about that, even though I did it in an academic book setting and all of that. It's unhelpful because then people think that you have some kind of animus against that person or you're trying to dunk on or beat that person, even when you take steps to try to prevent that interpretation. And so it just becomes a show for people. And then, we who are supposed to be concerned with learning about something, trying to understand a situation and think about what kinds of responses are possible, we seem to just be concerned with a status game and with who's got the bigger stick and who's got more followers. And it runs down the reputation of our work. It runs down the respect for what we do. It has all kinds of negative medium and long-term consequences for us when we engage in this stuff. But in terms of just influencer count, view count, hit count, distribution count, immediately it's very, very generative.
Yeah, and it was generative before the attention economy became what it is with the media revolutions of the last 50 years, it was already a thing, right? But now it is even more so. And so I want to touch on the fact that it was already a thing, and I want to use a couple of examples. If Heidegger, in the question concerning in the history of the concept of time, which is the lecture series he gave right before writing Being in Time, if he had not mentioned Rickert as an example of philosophy of science in a neo-Kantian vein, then I would be reading him and just going, okay, this is what you're saying is a dominant approach right now. And then I would have no one to go with to dig deeper into it. And I wouldn't have found out, oh, but Rickert was also like one of the main influences on Weber. And so Weber's actually heavily influenced by this approach to philosophy of science that Heidegger is critiquing at this period of his work. Without naming names there, I would be out in the dark taking Heidegger at his word. And a lot of times people do think that he's too abstract, not naming names. And then they think, oh, I just have to trust you that this is a thing, this thing that you're saying, which is also a thing that I run into. People will say, oh, you're saying that that's a trend. I don't see that. I've not seen that. That just sounds like you. You're just projecting. And then it puts me in this situation where now I want to use an example, but then it's like, well, then they're going to say that that example is being overblown. So then I have to actually somehow show that this is statistically representative, and it opens this
right. And now you're forced to argue in a very particular methodological way. And this is in part how that operates. Now, of course, in an academic setting, it's necessary to be aware of.
I just want to say the other, I was going to say Heidegger, then I was going to say Marx. So I wanted to juxtapose that to Marx, who bashes on journalists and petty economists all the time in a very incendiary way that Lenin took to like the max later. And so if Marx and then later Lenin had not done something similar, we might not even know who they were, and they might not have had any influence on history. And so it's like, I don't think Heidegger's super sensational in how he does it. It's a little bit more academic, but then you have Marxists, and when they do it or have done it, it tends to be a little bit more like, we're going to take this person's pants down and laugh at them, you know? And so that's the sort of binary I'm seeing between two approaches. But in both cases, if they hadn't done it, we might not know who they were. They might not have had any influence. But then also, we would have just been taking them at their word, trusting them, and we wouldn't have had any sort of concrete examples of the thing they're talking about.
So to clarify, in the academic setting, you of course have to show who you are reading and what you're referencing so that people can go back and check if what you're describing is really the case. In academic writing, you've got to do that. Of course you have to do that. And all of us who would, in public, maybe have a different way of writing or communicating, if we are people who have done academic writing, you can go and look at our academic writing and see who it is that we do cite. So somebody who reads me and thinks I'm vague posting has the option of going and reading my academic work and seeing who are the kinds of people that I cite, what are the kinds of discussions I participate in on that level. The issue with examples is that the function of examples is not really, it's not really about a question of trust. If I don't give examples, it's not because I'm asking you to trust that this is true without us first going over examples and examining whether the examples fit the trend I'm describing. What I'm trying to do is throw out an intuition I have about the discussion that might have been triggered by something I read recently, but the something I read is just incidental. It's the Archduke, it's the Franz Ferdinand. It's just the proximate thing to the intuitive observation that I make. So then I write something about, I'm noticing this trend, and you might not notice it. You might think that trend doesn't exist. Maybe I am reading something that is, maybe what I'm reading is too weird or too niche or too much in a bubble, and what I'm observing is not broadly the case. So you might go, I don't think that's true. And then we'd learn something. We'd learn that people operating in different parts of the discussion see or don't see this, depending on where they are. My invitation is for the person who's reading me to think about the stuff that they've been looking at and to see if they have the same intuition. So it's a kind of intuition check. So if I say it seems like there's too much naming names and dunking on people on the internet, I don't then give you a bunch of examples of people who are doing dunking on other people and go, see, this person dunked on that person and this person dunked on that person. See how common this is? No, what I do is I go, I've noticed that there's a lot of this dunking that goes on the internet. Do you also notice this? If you do, can we talk about it as potentially a social problem? And so it's a question that puts us on an equal footing. So rather than me be an authority and ask for you to trust me, I am telling you what I've noticed and asking you, have you noticed the same thing? It's really a request for replication. So if you are liking it or you reply with, yeah, this is something that's real, then you're replicating my intuition about the culture that I've been consuming. But if you reply with, I don't see that, or where are you getting this idea from? Or you seem to be making things up and you're vague posting, then that would suggest that my intuition is not as widely shared as I might think that it would be. And I would learn something from that. And I could learn something from that without us naming anybody or getting into any kind of specific example. Now, all of that doesn't mean that when I'm in an academic setting, I should do that, because in an academic setting, we are not concerned about trying to go after individuals. We are in a very careful, gentle way showing the stuff that we've been reading so that someone else can go back and check that stuff and see if they share our interpretation. Because in an academic setting, if you are if you're positioning what you're doing in relation to a body of work, there's a question about how that work's being interpreted and whether you're interpreting that work fairly or correctly. Sometimes what we're doing is not interpreting text. Sometimes what we're doing is not sola scriptura. It's an attempt to make a comment on society, which operates through a kind of intuitive digesting of the steady stream of content that comes in. And this is it's a different thing methodologically from reading a text, interpreting it, making an argument in reference to a text. Not everything has to be this. We don't have to continuously be in this textualism all the time. Sometimes, yes, when your academic work is in part about responding to a body of literature or entering into a body of literature. So interpretation in academic work and then showing what it is you're interpreting and where and how. Very important and necessary. But we aren't always engaging in interpretive methods. We don't always have to do that. And we don't always have to micro-foundations everything, be nominalist about everything, and distill every general claim into a bunch of particulars. We don't have to take every forest and make it individual trees to prove that a forest exists. Okay? If I go, it seems like we're lost in a forest, and you go, tell me about all of the trees in the forest before I will discuss the possibility that we're in a forest with you, we will never get to talk about anything that's to do with forests. We will spend all of our time, I'll go, well, look at this. This is a tree. And you go, well, maybe it's not a tree. Maybe it's a bush. And we just end up in a very small conversation that can never go where it needs to go. And imagine that each of these trees, each of these bushes is sentient and can get offended if you talk about it and refer to it. So now you're trying to have a conversation about how do we get through the forest, and all of the trees are attacking you and screaming at you because you mention them. You never get to a stage where you can zoom out at all and see anything. This drives me crazy.
It drives me crazy.
This insistence upon this it's nuts. It's so unproductive. But people think if you don't do this, that you're just making things up or engaging in mysticism or something. Because this kind of nominalism is just completely default in the culture. Micro-foundations, methodological individualism, expressed with in terms of an obsession with examples and placing examples above the thing that you're actually trying to talk about.
Part of why it's so perfect that this I'm not trying to influence Zoomers piece came to mind in this conversation is that the woman who provoked it in a sort of sense by reacting to the fact that I'm not trying to influence Zoomers was trying to get me to name names and critique a person on a panel that I was not impressed by. So basically, like, I came out and then she asked me point blank what I thought about a certain panel, and I said there was some good stuff on there, really interesting. And she's like, so there's some stuff you didn't like. And I was like, well, yeah, someone. And she's just like, who? She starts trying to, I'm like, no, I'm not really trying to engage with him or, talk about it. And she's like, well, if you think that he's wrong, then you need to say so. Because if you don't publicly critique him, then the Zoomers will fall for him. And I was like,
this is a problem. This is a problem with Marxism, and it comes from, they take their cues from the central figures in the tradition and the style of that stuff and the way that those people wrote. And sure, it got a lot of attention, but it also results in a lot of dogmatism. And part of the things that went wrong with Marxism came out of this some people have to be right, some people have to be wrong, some people are the good guys, some people are the bad guys, some people are revolutionary, some people are counter-revolutionary. You have to be responsible. This accountability and responsibility, you're tasked by things and you have to be responsible to all of this. It's very, very internecine in its whole ontological framework. And maybe we're in a context where that is the only way that you can distribute ideas. But given the history of the attempts by Marxists over the last 150 years in the United States and in Western Europe to distribute their ideas, it doesn't seem to work particularly well.
No.
Maybe it worked better in the 19th century. Maybe it worked better in the early 20th century. I don't think it works particularly well now to just go around and try to take the heads off everybody that you think is, the ruthless criticism of everything that exists that is used as an excuse to do this kind of stuff. The reference to that, it does produce certain tendencies in people who take that up as a rule and who use that as an excuse to indulge in behavior that's counterproductive.
Right. And then it combines with a sort of cultural revolution, calling to account. Let's have a struggle session. Let's make you a example. Let's have you, self-flagellate.
Yeah,
and
it can liquidate
confess
all the way in that direction.
Yeah.
And it really, there's a little bit of stoicism that runs through all of modern thought. And, stoicism will say on the one hand, of course, your behavior is a result of the material conditions, the kind of society you live in. Of course, the ideas that people have come out of all of this. And then yet it will also insist in the compatibilist way that Chrysippus originally insisted, that nonetheless, everything that you do is your fault and you're responsible for all of it. And you have to be treated as responsible for all of it. And you see this in the Soviet judicial system where you can be objectively guilty of a crime. You have to be punished because you did the thing, even though there was an objective character to the situation that led to your doing it. Nonetheless, you are the bearer of the thing. So you have to be treated as responsible and torn to shreds. There is sometimes a little bit of stoicism flowing that has to be checked.
I want to come back to this conversation about stoicism and also existentialism, because I saw that quote in that textbook where you're talking about existentialism and how I think your critique of stoicism carries out to your critique of existentialism. And maybe do that in a different episode. But for right now, we want to talk about autodidacts. We want to talk about how all of this comes back to them, right? And I think we should probably do a part 2 of this episode where we segue it into the churches thing. So let's maybe just like close this out with a connection that bridges us to that part 2 episode by just saying maybe what you wanted to say about the anything else that you want to say about the autodidact in reference to this expertise crisis and the ways that people in the underground are going to take things personally, right? Well, and I don't know if maybe a sort of segue there. Also, I indicated earlier there's a sort of slippery slope issue where the autodidact in a lot of cases already doesn't want to have to cite, just wants to say what they think, when in reality, like, they haven't usually done that academic humbling work or or put out a lot of research that shows that they've really spent time giving credit where it's due when it comes to their influences or how they are or are not intervening in the different fields that they're in relation to.
Yes, there is a need for humility. And unfortunately, for many autodidacts, the reason that they're autodidacts is that they're in some kind of situation that causes them to retreat into a hobby, niche interest, as a carapace, as a protective shell from whatever it is, whether it's a lack of love experienced in early life at the level of the family, whether it's getting bullied in school, whether it's working the wrong kind of job, whether it's not getting into or not having the funding for, not being able to go to university, whatever it is, there's usually with autodidacts something that happened that circumscribed their possibility such that they're interested in this thing, but only able to pursue it in the autodidactic way. And that thing often haunts whatever they're able to do. And, to the point where there's a quest to get recognition through this thing, to make up for the recognition that you don't get on the job or that you don't get at home or that you didn't get from your parents. There's a quest to be loved on the basis of what you're doing here. And this desire to be loved or to be seen as special or to have your genius that was denied to you recognized will often lead to a tendency to not want to admit that you've been influenced by anybody else. This, of course, it's a ridiculous idea, this idea that you can somehow just come into the world and have new original ideas without engaging with anybody, that you're not a product in any way of your social situation. And therefore, there are, of course, loads of people just like you who are products of similar situations who think just like you. That insistence that you must somehow be special and distinct, that's part of the carapace that helps people to cope with a situation where they've been plunged into being like everybody else through a lack of access to the kinds of structures and experiences that would meaningfully differentiate them. So this problem, it's a huge problem because it prevents even getting into the literature to the point at which you could take up the advice I'm giving about the not naming names. If you are using being interested in a hobby, being interested in an intellectual hobby to protect yourself from reality or to protect yourself from things that have happened to you, traumatic experiences that you've had, this is something that you have to work through before you can even enter into any kind of academic work, let alone then come out of the academy and check some of the negative tendencies that come out of being overly socialized by the university system. So part of the trouble is sometimes I'm writing stuff for me and people that I see as, in situations like mine, or that I presume are operating from a level of health and well-being that is generally not obtaining among the autodidacts. And the difficulty with the internet, with communicating over the internet, is that stuff that is written for people at particular stages inevitably gets read by people who are at other stages and then taken up by them inappropriately at the wrong times or moments. So I try to emphasize in that piece that if I'm teaching you, I'm going to want you to cite people, and you should. But in that particular piece, I wanted to talk more about the vague posting that I do and why I do it, because some people don't like it. And I want them to realize that I'm not just doing it out of cowardice. It's not just because I don't want to fight, although, of course, I don't, because it's not very productive to engage in that kind of fighting. But it's also because I do think there are ways of talking and energies that we can be in when we talk that we won't get into if we get involved in a status game about who's right, who's wrong, who's good, who's bad, holding people to account. I think all of this is deadening. I think when people start going, well, what about the accountability of this generation? Or what about the accountability of particular people for the things they say or the things that they do? This just leads you further and further away from any kind of structural response. And it's just a ready-made excuse, especially when you say that it's nonetheless compatible with structural thinking. It's a ready-made excuse to go in circles and to waste enormous amounts of time.
I think on that note, we should come back for part 2. And everybody, if you're interested in where this is going, we'll see you on part 2.
Subscribers get access to all past courses at Theory Underground, from Chris Catrone to Michael Downs, as well as ongoing courses taught by David McKerracher, Benjamin Studebaker, and Nina Power. Subscribers also get access to monthly research seminars, and the higher tiers of involvement unlock discussions and one-on-one small group tutelage. So if you're like me and you're never a huge bookish kind of person, but somewhere along the way you got really into listening to educational materials, if you got really into listening to podcasts and then books at work, if you love going deep into ideas, but you're just not a traditional bookish kind of person, well, this is where the alliance between people like us and people who are more bookish and specialized are able to meet to work through these things and do so in defense of the human, in defense of our dignity, in defense of our common humanity and our intellectual integrity. This is not a place where we're going to kick you out because you're pro-life or pro-choice, or where you are an atheist or a agnostic or a Christian. But it is a place where you're expected to love one another regardless of such things, and to show up for people in your actual IRL real life communities regardless of such things. Not to become a little online hater who just uses theory to manipulate other people and confirm your biases. No, Theory Underground is something else. And if that is exciting for you, and if you're excited to learn about what this approach, this method, this school of thought has to offer, then I'm excited to meet you. Subscribe today. Thank you.